rare though they are. I'm Claire Kilner. I head up the Alumni Relations team here at the university, and we are all delighted to have you here for our flagship event, the Cockcroft Rutherford Lecture, hosted by our President and Vice-Chancellor, Professor Dame Nancy Rothwell, and delivered this year by Professor Sir Peter Fahy. Before we begin the evening proper, I have a few housekeeping items to share with you. There is no fire test, alarm test expected, so if the alarm does sound, then it's the real thing, and staff will direct you to evacuate the building calmly and quickly via your nearest exit. As is usual at such events, can I ask you to turn your phones onto silent or switch them off if you would prefer. This is especially important today as we are recording the lecture and also live streaming it over the internet. And if you're joining us via the internet, welcome to you also. If you use Twitter, we're encouraging live tweeting, so if you do, you'll have to leave your phones on. And the hashtag for tonight's event is hashtag UOMCR17, so please do join in. I hope you enjoy this evening's event, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts at the reception afterwards. I'll now hand over to Dame Nancy to say a few words and formally introduce Sir Peter. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. So a very warm welcome to our alumni, our donors, our friends of the university to this annual Cockcroft Rutherford Lecture, our flagship event for alumni. And we're delighted to see so many of you here tonight and many more watching at home, and particularly delighted to see you, given I know there have been some very significant travel problems in Manchester today. I can't let this event pass without commenting on what happened on Monday. We are all still feeling the pain of that attack on our great city, its people and its visitors. And I was going to say a few words of my own, but then I read something written on Tuesday by one of our alumni student officers, Ilyas Nagdi. Ilyas was born and brought up in Manchester. He was a Manchester Access Programme scholar. And I just want to read a few words as part of what Ilyas wrote. Manchester was attacked yesterday, and she's still hurting. Words can't describe both our shared and individual pain, but already this great city is showing her might, her strength, her resilience. Manchester reminds me of my family. It's tough sometimes. We laugh, we cry, and we fight, but we remain united whatever happens. This time will be no different. Manchester always rallies. Literally rallies, whether we're marching against racism, celebrating our achievements, or standing together in grief. This attack was intended to divide us, but in Manchester it won't, I'm certain. Over the next few weeks, we must not forget what has happened. We must react, we must respond, we must be strong. We must be just that little bit more Mancunian. I wonder if I could ask you to stand as long as you're able while we just have a moment to reflect on the events of this week. Thank you. Please take your seats again. Following from the messages from the leadership of Manchester and Greater Manchester, we were very keen that this event continued. And of course, it honours Sir John Cockcroft, one of our alumni, and Lord Ernest Rutherford, a former staff member, for their outstanding and Nobel Prize-winning achievements during their time here at the University of Manchester. They're both a very important part of the rich heritage of the university, and we're particularly happy that members of the Cockcroft family are here tonight. This event is primarily for our alumni, and we now have an alumni community of more than 350,000 in over 150 countries. This year alone, over 350 alumni have come back to campus to share careers advice, benefiting well over 4,000 of our students. We're very grateful to you. By the end of next month, 139 alumni volunteers across Hong Kong, Paris, London, New York, San Francisco, Singapore, and Toronto will have hosted our students as part of our Global Graduate Scheme in 2016-17. Well over 600 alumni have mentored students through our various programs in this academic year. Over 6,000 alumni have made donations to support scholarships, research, and students. And I'd like to thank all of our alumni community, including those of you who are here tonight, for your continued support for the university. I'd just like to take a few moments to update you on a few events in the last year, since the last Cockcroft Rutherford. In October last year, we celebrated 10 years of the Manchester Access Programme, our flagship widening access programme, supporting young people living and studying in Greater Manchester to progress to university. 1,600 students have entered the university from the Manchester Access Programme, which is generously supported by many alumni. Earlier this year, we celebrated the 10th anniversary of the Equity and Merit Scholarship Scheme, which aims to assist talented but economically disadvantaged students from some of the world's poorest countries. University staff recently visited Uganda to meet some of our Equity and Merit alumni and discover the exciting work they're undertaking to transform their communities. Students in both these schemes are jointly supported by the university and by alumni donors. Thank you again. The delivery of our campus master plan continues to gather pace, as you may have spotted on your way here tonight, and indeed the buildings that have been completed have won many national and international awards. The site has now been cleared for the Manchester Engineering Campus development, which will house science and engineering at Manchester and allow relocation from our North Campus. The Alliance Manchester Business School and the hotel behind, which is a private operator, is well underway and is due for completion in 2018. And work on Brunswick Park, just near here, has started with the pedestrianisation and the greening of Brunswick Street and its transformation into one of the university's primary outdoor realms. We've been pleased to welcome Sir Howard Bernstein, former Chief Executive of Manchester City Council, who's joined the university as an Honorary Professor of Politics. And we were boosted by a very major award for cancer. Cancer Research UK awarded us almost £40 million over the next 5 years for the Manchester Cancer Research Centre. This was particularly important because some of you will have seen the tragic fire at the Patterson building a few weeks ago. And while the news carried the fact that this was at the Christie, in fact the occupants and all the activities in there were part of the university. And we've been so impressed by all the support we've had in relocating those staff and indeed in saving some incredibly valuable samples and research. We had a royal visit last October when the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge visited the National Graphene Institute and the Engineering Campus Development site. And Her Majesty the Queen honoured us by awarding a Regius Professorship as part of her 90th birthday celebrations in June 2016. This was given in recognition of the exceptional quality of our research in advanced materials and our teaching in that area. Professor Phil Withers is our inaugural Regius Professor of Materials, and we had a wonderful celebration for that event. There are many, many other things happening in the university, and I hope you hear about these through our newsletters and through our website. But now I'm delighted to invite our speaker this evening, Professor Sir Peter Fahy, to the stage. Sir Peter was a police officer for 34 years, serving in 5 forces and spending 13 years as Chief Constable of Cheshire and Greater Manchester Police. He held national responsibilities for workforce development and race and diversity, and was the national police lead for the Prevent Counter-Terrorism programme. On leaving policing, he became Chief Executive of the street children charity, Retrack. working on issues of modern slavery and trafficking. He's also chair of the Plusdane Housing Association, chair of Citizens UK, Greater Manchester, president of Manchester East Scouts, and an honorary professor of criminal justice in the School of Law here at the university. So could I please invite Sir Peter to come and deliver this year's Cockcroft Rutherford Lecture.
Thank you very much, Nancy. Thank you for that introduction. And of course, it has been a very, very difficult week. I am not a Mancunian by birth, but I actually applied to be the Chief Constable of Greater Manchester twice. First time, I think it was about 2002, when Mike Todd got the job. And I remember after one of the interviews, going back to the station, driving along the Mancunian Way, and looking at this huge city behind and thinking what an amazing thing it would be to be the Chief of Police of an area like that. Mike Todd got the job, and then I applied again sadly when Mike died in 2008. And again, I remember one evening standing at the top of Deansgate, where all the people come out from the Royal Exchange and from the MEN Arena, and thinking what a remarkable thing it would be to be the Chief Constable of a city like this. And when you have that enormous privilege, you come to really love and value this city. So I think, like a lot of us, I'm really hurting about what has happened. But also, as Chief Constable of Greater Manchester, it was an enormous privilege. And I had my frustrations with GMP, the wonderful thing that it is, its politics and its power bases and all the stuff that went on. But I had the most enormous respect for just the professionalism, the patience and the dedication of the ordinary police officers. And again, I think we've seen that this week. And who can imagine some of the things that they've had to deal with and will continue to deal with as they support the victims. So I think it's important that we recognise that as well here tonight. So I'm going to talk about a number of issues which are really, really important to me as Chief Constable. It is a pretty unique position being the Chief Constable. You get to see every aspect of life across Greater Manchester. I was thinking, most things in life you can make a choice about, can't you? You can choose whether to choose state education or private education, to use the NHS or go to private healthcare, which supermarket to buy, but you don't get any choice about your police force. If we're coming in your door, we're coming in your door. And so it actually, in a strange way, creates a dynamic that you see every possible aspect of life in a place like Greater Manchester. And quite literally, one day I could be in Downing Street having dinner with the Prime Minister. That only happened once. And the next day could go out and patrol and be in the house of a drug addict in a really desperate crisis in Bolton. And so it did, give me a sort of unique perspective of all the different aspects of this wonderful, wonderful place. And I really want to sort of try and pull out some of the things that really struck me about that. And then, as Nancy mentioned, since I left policing, I've been the Chief Executive of ReTrack, getting the chance to go to Africa and deal with the issues we have out there in trying to get children back to families, as well as other work I do with various schools and the Scouts, Plusdane Housing Association. And so I'm not very good at saying no, but what has been, I found again really interesting, was just the really strong common links between all those issues, but particularly the really strong links between what I was seeing in Manchester and what I'm experiencing in Africa in some of our work. So I want to try and draw that out tonight. I'm not an academic. I don't say that in any disparagement to academics, but having been associated with this wonderful place, and it's a real honour to be the honorary professor, and stepping away from policing, I realise we have a very different mindset. Someone once described me as having the attention span of a gnat, but I think it's more about the fact that when you're a police officer, a chief constable, it's 24 hours a day, it's 7 days a week. You very rarely get the option of not making a decision. You have to constantly make a decision on the basis of the information you have at the time. You can't decide, with due respect, to set up a discussion group or research project or whatever. you know, you have to get on and make that decision. And I know that seems obvious, but it's been really struck me in some of the work I've done, not just with this university, with other universities, how that is, as I say, it's just a different way of thinking. But quite seriously, the great thing is whatever happens on the road outside there tonight, Greater Manchester Police will just get on and deal with it. On the whole GMP, if there was something major going to happen tomorrow, GMP was brilliant. If it was something happening in 3 months' time, it struggled. So it's just part of the mentality. Right, in terms of all that, I'd just like to start with a short video just to really remind us of what is at the centre of tonight's lecture.
They brought me here when I have my issues. My mommy doesn't like me at home. And my daddy, he disappeared when I'm still young. I like my mom, but for her, he doesn't like me. And one day I woke up at morning, he took me somewhere, left me there, and I stayed 2 days when he doesn't come to pick me. They took me at police and they told me, I'm going to take you somewhere, you're going to stay there, you will not get worried. There is Gloria, there is Kalunji, here is Zauja, Marjorie, Sacha, is Nabukela. Oh, many people are sleeping here. Some of them are sleeping the other side.
So I assure you tonight is not an advert for Retrack. Other street children charities are available. But no matter how many times I see that video, it always affects me because it says something about the unique potential in every child and how special they are. Veronica was actually abandoned by her mother in a field and she stayed there for 2 days before she was found by the local police and taken to a Retrack centre. And we have now managed to get her back to her mother and helped her mother in terms of the crisis she was in to get back to parenting. But there's something really unique, as I say, about a child. And so tonight I want to talk about the whole issue about children and their early years and the importance of relationships and families. I want to talk about the importance of community and some of the real challenges we face here in Manchester and across the world in terms of inequality. And then I want to talk about some of the impact that we're seeing from globalisation and how that is affecting children and how it's particularly leading to the greatest mass movement of people we've ever seen. I joined policing in 1981. I actually joined the Hertfordshire Police in a place called Stevenage, which was in those days called a London new town. And it was an interesting place because they built one estate after another as Stevenage grew, and essentially the crime problem moved around as in each community essentially the children got to about the age of 14 or 15. And I remember in my first weeks being taken around by he was actually a really good police officer, a pretty gnarled individual, and he sort of pointed out sadly the young mothers, the young teenage mothers, and he basically said these children are going to be the issue in the future. And I suppose that then became my experience as time went on. And I often used to say to my new recruits when I was Chief Constable, if you think this is some great battle of good and evil, forget it, because most of the people you'll deal with you will think that if I'd been in their situation and their upbringing, I would have turned out probably the same way. There's a really good writer on policing at the moment, a guy called John Sutherland. He's actually a superintendent in the Metropolitan Police, and he talks very powerfully about the day-to-day experience of ordinary police officers. He's written a book called Blue, a memoir, Keeping the Police and Falling to Pieces, because it actually talks about as well some of the challenges he's had with his own mental health. But in the book, there was an article in the Sunday Times magazine a few weeks about it. He talks about a time in London where he dealt with quite a number, sadly, of very tragic deaths of young people, and particularly stabbings. And he says very powerfully about one particular murder. Within days, the team had made a number of arrests. All of them are children, and some of them are as young as 11 years old. One fact stands out clear from all the others. Every single one of them had grown up in a home where domestic violence had been a reality. Not a single exception. Now try telling me there's no link. Domestic violence is terrorism on an epic scale, a disease of pandemic proportions, and the single greatest cause of harm in society. And he later goes on to say, of course, not every person raised in a violent home will themselves grow up to become violent. The reality is much more hopeful than that. But my experience of those young men who do go on to cause serious harm is that it all began behind closed doors, hidden in their homes and their childhoods. It is one of the undeniable conclusions of my professional life. So this is saying something, really powerful about the importance of early years and the factors which impact upon child development. And the model we use in ReTrack, and I found it really powerful because, again, it reflected my own experience, was that you have at the heart of it a vulnerable child, but then their development is so crucially affected by their family, by the strength of the community around them, by the national government policies and structures, and then by international governments and societies. And again, I've been really struck how my experience here in Manchester has absolutely reflected my experience in Africa. You can go out to Ethiopia, to one of the rural areas, talk to one of our social workers. Why do children run away to end up on the street? You assume that they're going to say poverty, and they say poor parenting. In the audience tonight is Barbara Spicer, who is Chief Executive of Plustone Housing Association. She was the Chief Executive of Salford Council. And Barbara and I worked very closely together, and there became a point in my career as Chief Constable. For the previous about 30 years, every year the government had written a bigger cheque, and politicians had been in competition to promise more police officers. But it got to a point where a guy called George Osborne turned up and announced there were going to be cuts in policing, and we had to reduce our budget by about 20%, and I lost 1,600 police officers. And what that causes you to do is look very, very closely at your demand. Where is your demand coming from? Because if you're going to have less staff, you're going to be able to do less work. And work with Barbara, and what really struck us was how much of the work was repeat business. We looked at one particular family in one part of Salford. The cost of that family to GMP over a year was about £50,000. It would have been cheaper to have a police officer living with the family. I think it cost social services over £200,000. We couldn't find out how much it cost the health service because in the chaotic nature of their lifestyle, they were going to different doctors and different hospitals. Now, you would have thought that these people getting all this attention from the public services, they must have been really flying. They must have been really improving their situation. They weren't. They were becoming more and more chaotic and more dependent. And of course, if you were the neighbour of this family and you saw all these different police officers and social workers and everybody else turning up, filling in more assessment forms, what do you think your view of the public service is? And what was interesting then, when we mapped that sort of picture and we looked at other families and we mapped the data against fire service data, educational underachievement data, the people who most regularly go to A&E at the local hospitals, almost whatever data you wanted to pull out, it brought you back to the same people. And when we did further examination on this, and that involved things like we'd go to Rochdale and bring the agencies together, we'd identify perhaps 5 key families, and we'd all get all our files out about those families over a 3-day period. What was really striking, number one, was a huge amount of information that all the agencies had about those families and not necessarily sharing that. Sometimes that led to issues being identified which caused people to rush out immediately to put some action in place. But was also really striking, as John Sutherland said, was how domestic violence was absolutely running through every single family. It was also striking how every time a member of that family went to prison, when they came out, their offending moved up another level. And they became more and more chaotic. And the fact is, about this, while you may say, a bit of a revelation, when you look into it, you recognise this issue is just so incredibly well researched. There is so much research about the importance of attachment theory, about the crucial importance to a child's development of having a secure, loving relationship in their early years. Absolutely quite staggering, and I can quote you various people, Bowlby and Ainsworth, and other people that have done these studies. They have shown that the importance of this loving relationship is just really important to the way that a child develops in terms of how they then conduct their relationships, how they cope with being able to identify the different dynamics in relationships, and how when they don't have a solid attachment, it leads to all sorts of other issues around bias, hostility, and a wariness of close relationships. And it's interesting, again, when we were looking at some of those cases, and you looked at perhaps a domestic violence perpetrator, and you went back 20 years to their file from the maternity ward, again, this was utterly predictable. And when you talk to, for instance, nurses who work in the maternity ward, they say this is really obvious, because it's when mother looking after baby, whether mother is got eye contact with baby or is looking elsewhere. It is as fundamental as that. And again, what's really interesting is this extensive research has shown that this is universal. It's not just applied to certain cultures or certain groups. It's been applicable to all the cultures across the world that they've so far studied. And around that clearly is the importance of parenting. And it's what the research shows, that if you grow up in an atmosphere of strife and of violence, that is your learned behaviour. And you just keep on repeating the cycle. That is how you think parenting is done. So when you grow up to be a parent, unfortunately, in many cases, you practice the same behaviour, and sadly the cycle is repeated. The other thing we really recognise from the studies we did on the families was also that they stayed in very tight geographical areas. Probably most of the people in this audience are used to lots of foreign travel, going around the world, all sorts of things. There are children in Greater Manchester, like children in Rochdale, who will have never been to Manchester city centre, who will have never seen the sea. So it can be very misleading in a wonderful city like ours, with all the transport links and the trams and the buses, not to recognise that there are still very insular communities and children who do not get those experiences. But crucially, what that's telling us is that place is so very, very important. That people hold on to place, and that often the families and individuals who are facing these sorts of challenges, and particularly the families and individuals who are taking up most of the public expense and the activities of the public agencies, they have a whole range of complex problems. And the difficulty is, on the whole, the public service doesn't recognise that, because we are arranged as police, social services, education, health. That is not the reality of people and families in this situation. I remember fairly early days when I was Chief Constable of Cheshire going to, it's called a MARIC, Multi-Agency Risk Assessment Conference on Domestic Violence in Congleton. And they kept on discussing individual cases. So here's a case of a woman suffering domestic violence. And the challenge was it wouldn't stay in the box. Because when you looked at the woman, the perpetrator was a persistent offender, there was a mental health issue, there was an addiction issue, there was an issue about the child at school. And so you just couldn't see it as purely a domestic violence issue. And what we've really tried to do under the devolution agreement here in Manchester is to try and come up with place-based interventions which bring agencies together at the very local level. And it's interesting, if you ask me what was the one thing, the thing in Greater Manchester Police that we did that had the biggest impact on the culture of police officers, it was actually getting police officers to work alongside social workers, probation officers, health professionals, because they suddenly started to realise that the world was a far more complex place. But the trouble is, while I think lots of people are starting to get this in Greater Manchester, with due respect, in London, government is organised around those separate ministries and really struggles to envisage a way about how they could be joined up and how they could actually join up their different funding regimes and performance regimes and all those other things which get in the way. But here we have a unique opportunity here in Greater Manchester to actually take that forward in a different way. What we can see from attachment theory as well, and from the importance, as I've said, about domestic violence, is that importance of early relationships. It is the way that we learn about how to conduct relationships ourselves from the relationships we have in our own family. So if you get poor parenting in the early years, you have all these issues about low self-esteem, you have issues around aggression and delinquency, depression, anxiety. You have, again, this issue about intergenerational transmission of maltreatment. And as I say, it's also the fact that you yourself then have difficulty in forming positive relationships. And I think this is also interesting in the context of the huge challenge we see at the moment in terms of mental health. Because I think what that's telling us is absolutely we need to have services to try and help and rescue people at the point of crisis. But a lot of this comes from, when you go back again, it is problems around issues of parenting and issues of low self-esteem at a far earlier stage. We can all have ideas and views at the moment about what might come out of the election. My own view is that actually what's been happening most recently, where we seem to have started to have a more honest conversation about mental health, where you've had the royal family, various celebrities leading a conversation to say that we all have, lots of us have mental health challenges, that I almost think that that might have a more positive impact on our society than whatever comes out of the general election, because it is such a crucial, crucial issue. In Greater Manchester Police, as in most police forces, at least a third of the work is directly related to mental health. When you need to play in issues around offending and domestic violence, and you link that back to mental health and relationships, you see it is a really, really strongly abiding issue. And so that, and it's still, we all know it's still an issue. We all know it's still an issue that in many workplaces you can ask for time off because you've got a back problem and you need to go to a chiropractor or whatever it might be. But if you ask for some time off because you've got an anxiety or depression problem and you need to go in for counselling and a psychiatrist, still there are too many workplaces and too many individuals that think they could not admit that. So still a lot more work to do on that, but absolutely crucial, as I say, to the future of our children, and a real issue about early years development. And I think the other reflection from, I'll come to inequality in a minute, the other reflection I have from this is that this stuff takes a long time. From the work we did in Greater Manchester, we got involved in what's been called the Troubled Families Programme. Now you can talk about whether that's the right term or not, but it was actually promoted by the government at that time to try and put more resources into focusing on those families. the difficulty is that people have said that that programme has failed. Well, it's only been going 2 or 3 years. The idea that you can change around a family which possibly has had those sorts of issues over many generations, really complex, ingrained difficulties, and that you can achieve that change in 2 years, and you can start to see indicators around employment and the rest of it, and you can start measuring stark differences, it just isn't going to happen. So there's something, again, about our political horizons that we put the long-term investment in to say this can't be about separate initiatives, it has to be about a longer-term problem and a longer-term approach. I want to talk about the impact of inequality, because again, this was something which was really starting to strike me as Chief Constable of Greater Manchester, and again, is a huge issue in Africa, but obviously across the world. And I find it really striking. These are pictures of Kampala in Uganda. You've got the towers of the city centre, the shiny buildings, and then you've got the slums where a lot of the street children work. And indeed, I mean, I think anybody that's travelled knows sadly in many countries across, or many cities across the world, that is the reality. The huge gaps between the rich and the poor in different districts. What really struck me, though, is that we have that issue here in Manchester and in Greater Manchester. We're all very proud of the shiny buildings, the cultural festivals, the wonderful new theatres, home, all those places. But the reality is that can hide quite glaring levels of inequality. I remember going to visit the famous Sister Rita, who was running a food bank in Collyhurst, and we drove down through the estate, and I'll be honest, it was like Bosnia in terms of the state of the place, the tower blocks there which were due to be demolished, the sheer poverty of the people, and I looked, you could just see in the distance the shiny co-op building, and it's that thing that just literally the other side of the ring road can be amazing, you know, an amazing gap in terms of the perception. And what it worried me was that it felt like that gap was getting greater and greater. And also, particularly, and this is no disrespect to London, but London-based journalists and London-based politicians were becoming less and less aware of that reality. And that whatever might be the sort of official figures, for instance, about what's happening in Greater Manchester, I became more and more concerned that there were a growing group of individuals who, for instance, were not bothering to register to vote, were not in the benefits system, were involved in various types of petty criminality or counterfeiting or bootlegging alcohol or whatever it might be, but were just more and more disengaged. Inevitably this week there's been a big focus, as there always is after these attacks, about the Muslim community, if such a thing actually exists, and things like the level of alienation. I'd have to say to you as Chief Constable of Greater Manchester, what I found was that the greatest levels of alienation and anger and distrust were actually in areas like Salford. White working class areas that felt completely and utterly disengaged from the rest of Greater Manchester. Who didn't particularly have any belief in the police or the criminal justice system. Certain characters ran their own criminal justice system, and certain characters in organised crime promoted a totally different set of values in terms of how you got recognition. There's a very good French writer at the moment, I don't know if any of you saw it, it isn't in this week's New Statesman, it was in last week's New Statesman. It's got one of these strange names which are quite hard to pronounce in French, Guilluy, G-U-I-L-L-U-Y. And he's written quite a lot about the way that French society is changing. It's all written in French, but this article in the New Statesman has sort of summarised it. And he talks about la France périphérique. And this isn't really a reference to the ring road around Paris. It's a reference to, again, that growing gap, not just in economic inequality, but a gap in aspiration. And what he describes, essentially, is that there are a group of people in France and certain cities that have really seen the benefit of globalisation. who've been able to access, new markets, digital opportunities, new economy, all those sorts of things. And then at the other end, you've got a growing group of immigrants who essentially service those people, who serve them coffee and are housemaids and look after their children and all the rest of it. And the traditional French working class have been completely squeezed out. Not only squeezed out from the economy, but actually also squeezed out geographically because they can no longer afford to live in certain of those areas. And in the banlieue, the immigrant communities have completely taken over. And he highlights how that group of working class people see issues like diversity, immigration, some of the impacts, or some of the things that the so-called, what you might call the liberal elite, promote as completely utterly irrelevant. And that has led to things like the growth of the support for the Front National, and obviously leads to things like Trump in America. And again, without being too provocative, I saw signs of that again in Greater Manchester. I hope I'm not going to upset anybody tonight, but when I was Chief Constable of Greater Manchester, I hadn't ever particularly heard of Didsbury. There was a police station called West Didsbury. I think I went on patrol there once, but it didn't really feature much in my day-to-day life. It was Rochdale, Oldham, Bolton, South Manchester, Salford, all those places. Since I've left policing and done more work with the university and the charity sector and the churches, Didsbury suddenly seems to be a big part of my life. Now, that's no way in any disrespect, because also, where do I live? I live in Cheshire, and again, you can live in Cheshire and think the greatest thing going on in the world is dog fouling or tractors driving on the grass verge. It is that issue that a lot of writers are now highlighting, that we're living in increasing bubbles, that social media, instead of opening the huge wild wide web, is actually leading us to live in more enclosed communities where we go on Twitter and communicate with people that think and agree with us, and we're not aware of this growing gap. And that is becoming, I think, more and more of an issue. So that's a sort of level of inequality which, again, is not just about a gap between rich and poor. It's not just about an issue for developing countries. It's also about things like the gap in education and social aspiration, and this growing isolationism, and people living in a bubble. We see it obviously in things like the decline in some of the voting levels in certain communities as well. The other issue I'd want to highlight again is the issues around educational underachievement. I've always been involved in schools. I've been a school governor for about 25 years. I'd have to say again that as Chief Constable of Greater Manchester, I never felt that the whole issue about school achievement was taken seriously enough. You may know that one of the big issues really in Greater Manchester is low skills and poor educational achievement. And it just really struck me that that was never given the prominence that it required. And if you look at any of the national figures, if you look at the performance of the schools in London compared to Manchester, if you look at the proportion of schools which are rated outstanding, Manchester and Greater Manchester still lags seriously behind. And I think all of us involved in public policy and this wonderful institution here needs to be taking that more and more seriously. Because that obviously breeds that inequality, and it breeds that frustration and that alienation. We see these features, particularly again in the United States. I recently did some work with the Chicago police. Chicago last year had 762 murders. It's got about the same population as Greater Manchester, where we had about 40. And again, what's interesting is yet again, those murders are concentrated in certain districts where there are the most horrendous levels, again, of drug dealing, of heroin addiction, and again, hugely alienated communities. And we see that increasingly as well in things like the impact of the benefits changes. One of the things that really struck me being involved in the housing association world is what are going to be enormous impacts from the changes in housing benefit, which have still got to feed through, which basically means that for people under 35, it is going to be increasingly difficult to get any state help whatsoever. And that undoubtedly is going to lead to greater homelessness, sofa surfing, but ultimately a growing group of people who are not engaged. When you then play in the impact of greater digitalisation, the fact that more and more jobs are being replaced by technology, by robots, and again something which I don't think I hear any of the politicians talking about in the general election, I think that is going to be made even more and more difficult. The other aspect I think for me about this is about the importance of community. Community probably you could say is one of those words which is sort of overused, and we seem to use it more and more recently. But when you think about it, it is a pretty fundamental word. We are a social species, particularly when you go to Africa, it is incredibly tribal. And the family and that wider community is incredibly, incredibly important. And therefore, in the work we do in Africa, you can take a child back to a family from the street, you can do a lot of work to try and support that family, but what's crucial is how you build a community around it, because the whole concept of the village brings up the child. And again, here in Greater Manchester as Chief Constable, for me, what really struck me again, you can have this big metropolis, but actually it's just a whole series of communities. And right across Greater Manchester, there are so many distinctive neighbourhoods, you know, from Droylsden to Eccles to the Fallinge Estate, wherever you want to talk about. It is all about community. And therefore, how we try and support and promote community activity is really, really important. And today I've actually been at an event at the Muslim Heritage Centre where we were talking about how to break down some of the mistrusts between Muslim groups and other groups, and it all came back to relationships within community. It's about whether different people are talking to one another, whether there are community events which people can get involved in. And for me, it was even more fundamental than that. In the years where there was quite a lot of money under the Blair government, the trouble is we created an idea that the public were the customer. There were policing pledges, there were league tables, there were targets for how quickly the police would get to you and answer the phone and all that stuff. And the difficulty was that it creates this idea that we're all customers, when actually we're all citizens. And the challenge should be, how do we get people involved to help them sort out their local problems? And this is not just an issue about, gosh, we're short of resources now, we need people to do things for themselves. It was all my experience around Greater Manchester was that local people produce the best solutions. Local people know their area. The best person to help a troubled family is somebody often who themselves has had to bring up a troubled family, a difficult teenager, whatever it might be. So it's a fundamental issue about how we promote community. And I think it's also a fundamental issue about the importance of local democracy and how we try and foster that local action. Again, as was said at the opening, I've been involved with a number of other people, particularly Mohammed, the Muslim chaplain, and the Catholic chaplain here at the university, in creating a Manchester branch of Citizens UK, which is absolutely about how you try and encourage local community action, bring different groups together to help them solve local problems. And I was struck, I was out in Ethiopia again in a rural area talking to one of our staff, and we're running a really good project there, which again is all based around community, using women in self-help groups, savings clubs, things like that. But this guy, Yilma, he said to me, he said, the problem is when you're down the aid hole, you can look up at the sky and you can see the sun, but you're not free and you're totally dependent. If somebody puts down a ladder and you can climb out of the aid hole, you can dance in the sun and you are free. And I thought that was a really powerful image, because there is a real danger in the way the public service operates in this country and the way overseas aid and what might be called the aid industry operates in underdeveloped countries, that you promote almost a culture of dependency, and particularly a sort of parent-child attitude. So the real priority is actually how we help people to help themselves. We recognise that some of the institutions which used to hold people together, like trade unions, like churches, like community centres and pubs, have often been weakened, and there we need to put in alternative structures and processes, try and encourage and help that to grow along. And all this is crucial to the development of the child, because it is again about that child existing within a community, helping to understand social norms and relationships within a community of other people. And also, it's about how people feel involved and part of that community, and a sense of ownership. And again, I don't want to dwell too much on the events of this week, but the danger is we end up with alienated people. We particularly end up with alienated young people. And in Greater Manchester, some of those alienated young people decide to get into drug dealing and organised crime. And some, sadly, clearly as you see, have got involved in extremist political activity and sometimes violent extremism. But it is all not helped when there is that sense of alienation. So power of community enables you, as I say, to have that idea of moving towards citizenship, not being a customer. But clearly the crucial question as well is, how do we find new economic models? Because again, when I travelled around Greater Manchester and you went to some of the more difficult and deprived estates, the idea that somehow a multinational is going to come along and open a new factory and suddenly provide employment is not going to happen. As I said earlier, with the impact of digitalisation, we're going to see more and more impact on that. Everything says there are going to be a decline in traditional jobs, and it is how we're going to come up with new economic models which are going to give meaning to people, and again help people to be involved, and we don't end up with economic models which actually increase alienation and isolationism. But as I say, certainly we found in our work in Africa that if you can strengthen community, if you can particularly bring women together and help them to create savings groups, and they might save literally 5 pence a week, but as that grows, they're able to buy chickens or a goat or buy some flour to actually buy, make some cakes and sell them. And it means then that they're able to strengthen their family and keep their child in education. What again I found interesting in my work with aid agencies is you can see all different sorts of charities and all sorts of different programs, but actually at the heart of it is family. And you can build a new well or a new pump or do whatever the program you have. If you've not got strong families, it's likely to fail. And crucial to the strength of a family is keeping children in education, and particularly keeping girls in education. Almost if there is one thing you can do, it is actually try to keep girls in education. Because again, across most of the underdeveloped world, there are really staggering levels of girls removing themselves from education for a whole range of issues. Apparently there are 770 illiterate adults in the world. Two-thirds of those are women. And at the moment, the estimate is it's going to take us 60 years to get to the same levels of completion in education amongst women that we presently have in men. And so for this to happen, you have to strengthen families, you have to try and really work that families value the importance of keeping a child in education and don't see sending the child to the street as the only way forward that they have. The last section I wanted to talk about was the impact of globalisation. When you go to Africa, and particularly when you go to Uganda, they've all heard of Manchester because of Manchester United and Wayne Rooney. It's interesting, actually, some of them are also know Manchester because of the generosity of the people in sending them out stuff, and the immense generosity of Greater Manchester police officers in supporting street children out there. But I've been really struck about the fact that you can go to a really poor village, and I've had the privilege of spending time in quite a few mud huts, sitting next to women who give you the most incredibly warm welcome, and quite literally, you will have a picture of Jesus Christ on one wall, and you will have a Manchester United team shot on another. You cannot believe the penetration of this brand. It is quite incredible. And again, you can go through very poor villages, and at the side of the road will be a blackboard saying, "Tonight, Manchester United versus Chelsea." They have found a way of hooking up into satellite television. And undoubtedly, the Premier League is a wonderful thing. It puts Manchester on the map, all those sorts of things, brings a lot of joy to people. But you can appreciate it also creates very unrealistic expectations, because you meet lots of young lads who think just because they play football, if they can get to Europe, they'll get a game and be a Premier League star. And this is clearly the impact of globalisation we're seeing. Because again, what's striking is you can go to that African village, you can go to the mud hut, there'll be a very uncertain electricity supply or whatever, but they will all have mobile phones because it's relatively cheap, and again, they can hook it off the satellite. And so the real challenge is the gap between the day-to-day reality of a young person living in that African village and the weakness of the rural economy and what their day-to-day life and their prospects are, and what they might see on the satellite television about the Premier League and what Manchester looks like, and what increasingly they'll pick up on their mobile phone. The gap is just enormous. And there's lots of people working in this field that feel it's almost going to be impossible to hold back that tide. And the other thing you've got happening in Africa is just enormous levels of population growth. So Malawi, one of the poorest countries in the world, at the moment has a population of 15 million, which it cannot feed, and the estimate is in 3 decades it will get to 50 million. So it is not surprising that we are seeing the biggest movement of mass movement of people that we've ever seen. But it's also about the way, and we all see it, don't we? We travel around the world, and everywhere looks like everywhere else, because we've got all these brands. But it's not just about that, it's about the way that this globalisation is also feeding in global values. It is about the way that, the celebrity culture, the particular attitude we may have in our society, or particularly in American society, is now feeding straight in to the way that young people across all countries are viewing things. This was expressed particularly powerfully to me by it was actually a cardinal in Thailand, who was talking about the fact that globalisation, and particularly mass tourism that they were seeing, wasn't just creating an enormous sex trade that lots of their young women were being trafficked into, but was just almost fundamentally undermining all the values of their society and all their traditional cultures, because it was just constantly feeding in all these global attitudes and completely giving young people completely unrealistic expectations of what the future might look like. And as I say, that is leading to the greatest movement, mass movement of people the world has ever seen. And when you play that, again, the weakness in the rural economy, the impact of climate change, everything says that's going to get more and more difficult. As we make it more difficult for people to come legally into this country or into Europe, then obviously you're giving greater room to the illegal people smugglers and the traffickers. And we see more and more people caught in trafficking and in modern slavery. So what happens again in countries like Ethiopia is that you are struggling to bring up your family in the rural area, and somebody comes along and says, if you give me your older child, I'll take them to the city, I'll get them a job, and they'll be able to send back money to the family. And the reality of what happens is the child is taken into forced labour as a servant, is treated completely differently from the rest of the children in the household, is going to lose their education, and often physically abused and sexually abused, and ends up on the street. So it's the way this whole sort of globalisation is leading to this, and particularly is leading to a huge movement into cities, and then again in a lot of Africa, young women in particular are being trafficked into the Middle East, either again to be in the sex trade or domestic servants. So it's really important that we recognise the impact of this globalisation on children, the way it's leading to so many children. The estimate is anywhere between 100 and 150 million children living on the street every night, and how globalisation is feeding into that, how it is undermining a lot of the normal community life. And so I want to finish really by just reflecting on some ways forwards and some proposals. How can we give children a better start in life, given how crucial it is, the early years of a child, to their future development and lots of other social issues that we see? So for me, it is that commitment to early years. It is that recognition of the importance of attachment theory. I do find it really strange that this is so well researched and so well understood, and yet so many people and so many aspects of public policy seem to ignore it or not recognise it. Somehow as well, we seem to have got into a bit of a difficulty about talking about families. Now, obviously, families exist in different forms, but it almost feels we feel uncomfortable in talking about the importance of family. And family is crucially important to the future development of a child. And as I said earlier, it's really important that our commitment to early years development and supporting families and giving a real importance to how people develop relationships, that's got to be a commitment which lasts beyond political horizons, which isn't about the next government or the next initiative or the next funding stream. I feel we need greater efforts on closing equality gaps, and I think it's a real challenge for Manchester and Greater Manchester that we recognise that whatever might be the success of the city centre and so many things we're proud of, it can hide the fact that there are yawning gaps in terms of inequality, economic inequality, and gaps in aspiration, and that then leads to increasing isolationism. And we can make a choice, as actually sadly often happens in American society, that we can just abandon those areas, and they are the poor people, which often means they are almost the bad people, and you can have a police force which basically keeps those poor people in that area and makes sure they don't come in, or you can have a real commitment to saying that is not the way forward for our society. We need to try and close those inequality gaps. We particularly need to try and improve educational standards, and we need to confront this issue of isolationism and recognise that there are too many people not playing an active part in our society and see some of our social norms and social institutions as irrelevant. The third issue for me is that you really need policies which promote and value community effort and put local people in control. There are some politicians who say, well, who are these people? They don't particularly trust political activists because they say who elected them. There are some wonderful councillors and politicians across Greater Manchester, but I also met lots and lots of wonderful local people who'd set up a social club, set up a lunch club, amazing people in the Boys and Girls Clubs network, for instance, who are just the sort of people who, when they saw a local issue, a local problem, could get people together, could get a bit of money out of the business, and got a community effort going. And it's really important that public policy actually celebrates that, pushes power down, and really tries to break the parent-child attitude and say the best ideas come from local people. What did that look like in Greater Manchester Police? Well, we completely restructured Greater Manchester Police around neighbourhood policing and really tried hard to say that is the most important part of policing. And what's encouraging is a lot of the top counter-terrorism officers will say, yes, you can have surveillance and MI5 and all these people, but actually it has to be built on a foundation of neighbourhood policing, which is engaging with local people, which is finding out what is bothering them, that is building the sort of relationships where they have the confidence to pass information about potentially dangerous people. And so when we sadly had to make all the cuts in Greater Manchester Police, there was one group that we didn't touch, and that was the 800 community support officers, because they were the people every single day that were out in the local area. So it's that sort of decision, really, hard decision you have to make, to say local community effort, and particularly valuing your members of staff who are good at encouraging community effort and bringing in volunteers. You've got to really value those people in your policy efforts, but we also need to push resources down and really try and break this idea that the state can solve all your problems, and that whatever it might be, dementia, mental health or whatever, that somehow it's down to state agencies and how we get more co-production, and I could give a whole lecture about that. The last bit I talked about was also place-based integration. It is about these models of reorganising the public service in a different way so that you have all the various agencies working at that local level, recognising the importance of place, but with, again, an enormous commitment to be drawing in volunteers and engaging with local people. And this is really difficult stuff because you have to work through the particular professional cultures, there's often funding regimes and all the rest of it. It was a bit easier here in Greater Manchester Police because I got to a stage where I could say, we have one boss, Tony Lloyd, he's the interim mayor, he happens also to be the Police and Crime Commissioner. It is not a GMP van or a GMP computer, it belongs to the people of Greater Manchester, and what I want you to do is work in that community to make the community a better place. We have the freedom to do that in Greater Manchester. I know Ian Hopkins, my successor, is taking that forward, and there's lots of really good things happening. But this issue about based integration and how you break people out of their professional silos and organisational silos to be really dealing with the issues important to local people is absolutely crucial. We need to recognise the importance of the global community. On the day that Trump was inaugurated, our dear friend, I stood with a number of other individuals, including Catholics and Muslims and all sorts of other people, to say it had to be about bridges, not walls. Obviously, we need border controls. Yes, there are difficult issues about immigration, but we are one world. And the fact is we can't put the genie back in the bottle. There was a time when Africa was in darkness and people there had no idea what was going in Europe. That is no longer the case. We are now one global community. The internet has opened up all those images. And unless we find a way of bridging, again, that huge inequality gap, the issue about mass migration is just going to get greater and greater and greater. We have to adopt policies, and, you know, we need to be fair as well. Our government has given that commitment to overseas aid. I wish they would promote it and be more proud about it, because when you are out in Africa, you do actually see the enormous influence of our country because we are so proactive in giving overseas aid and the influence that that gives us. But as I say, it's fundamentally recognising that we are one global community, and building more walls and fences is not going to solve this. And then the last thing is we stand together. When it actually came from the awful attacks in Paris, the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and when I was Chief Constable, people from the Jewish community came to me and said, we feel isolated, we feel scared, we think there'll be a backlash, we don't think we have a future in this country. Can you please provide more armed officers? And I talked to good friends in the Muslim community, and they said to me, we feel scared, we think there'll be a backlash, we don't think we've got a future in this country. And it certainly made me realise, yes, we could have more security, or we could actually bring those people together. So we started a campaign called We Stand Together here in Manchester. You'll have seen the term used quite a lot, sadly, over the last week. It was used in Wembley at the recent internationals after one of the attacks, I think it occurred in Germany. But fundamentally, it's saying that diversity is our strength. One of the wonderful things about Greater Manchester as a model is, for all the issues I've talked about, people have come here from all sorts of different backgrounds and religions and parts of the world, and for all our difficulties, on the whole, live in harmony day to day in our workplaces, in our universities, wherever it might be, and we just get on, because one of the most fundamental British values is live and let live. And some people, and certainly in all my work on prevent, agenda and counter-terrorism, said multiculturalism has failed. I fundamentally disagree. If you look at Greater Manchester, multiculturalism has succeeded. We've not had some of the levels of alienation that you see in countries like France, because we have a model where we say we're not going to abandon certain communities and we can try and build around common values. And again, part of the We Stand Together campaign moving forward is that we want to be more proactive in seeking research and actually going out there and saying diversity is something to be proud of, and Greater Manchester is actually a model for lots of other cities around the world where there are far greater levels of alienation and internal conflict. So thank you very much for listening to me. I've covered quite a lot of ground. It is always really important at the end of a thing like this to come back to, it is about the child. It is about recognising that every child is unique, that many of the issues we struggle with in our society comes back to those early years and child development and the importance of relationships and the importance of families. And I think if we always keep that child in the forefront of our policy and recognise that every child is special and unique, it is the best thing that can drive us forward. Thank you.
Can I just say thank you so much, Peter, for that thoughtful, thought-provoking and inspirational lecture. We're very, very grateful to you, and many of the things you've talked about are incredibly important to this university. Peter's kindly agreed to take a few questions. We do have a little time for questions before the reception. We have some roving microphones, I think. So anybody like to ask a question? We've got one there in the middle, thank you.
Thank you. As a Manchester and Didsbury resident, and proud of Manchester in particular, born, bred and educated at this wonderful university. What you're really saying, I think, is what many of us who've worked and lived and experienced the complexity of the interaction in cities, is that there are two things. We have to work locally to get the family at the centre of our activities and plan that better, and we've done that abysmally badly. But internationally, that is so much more complex, and although we may be a global, you talked about us being global, the sad thing is we are nation states who still believe in their own pride and power and won't understand that the necessity of that interaction. But the most important thing that I think I'd like you to comment on is, in relation to Manchester itself, if we do get the Northern Powerhouse going, to make the point that it isn't going to be done in 2 years or 5 years in the cycle of a particular election campaign. It's going to be 20 or 40. And what's your view about that?
I think some really good points. I mean, I would say that whatever may be individual nation states, again, my experience of being in a new industry, the aid industry, is there's a danger. There's lots of different initiatives, often generated by different charities, pursuing what their own donors want them to pursue, a lot of this from big international grant-making organisations. And it's trying to recognise that you can be doing all these different things, but actually the most important thing to concentrate on is family. And obviously what you tend to find is actually in lots of other cultures, they still recognise that. It is very rare for ETRAC not to be able to find a family for a child, because even if the immediate family is in difficulties, we can normally find a member of the extended family. So I think it's really important that the aid agenda really concentrates on that importance of families and early relationships. I think the comment I would make about the Northern Powerhouse, I suppose, is what are we aiming for? What is the goal? And if the goal is, with due respect, more shiny buildings and cultural centres, which are great in themselves, and it's not matched by an equal commitment to social justice and to equality and everybody involved, then ultimately it will fail. Or it will work if you can have a nice shiny city centre, have more security guards, make more of the public space private, make the police the boundary so all these people don't come into our nice shiny centre, which happens in a lot of American cities. Now, to be fair, when Tony Lloyd became interim mayor, and I'm sure Andy Burnham will be the same, he personally had a very strong commitment to say it cannot just be about economic development and an economic model. It also has to be about a social model. And there has to be this real commitment that unless we recognise those drivers of isolationism, the Northern Powerhouse, as I say, will be great for people from London who can come up on HS2 and go to all these cultural events. But, if you're living on the Phalange estate, probably your life is going to get a lot worse.
Thank you. Got a question down here, and then I think we've got one here.
Professor, you gave us a picture of the complexity of the issues facing a troubled family in Salford. I wonder if you could cheer us up with a local success story.
Oh, I mean, there's, loads and loads of success stories and families that are turned round. But the greatest success that I saw was when you had those local public servants, police officers, social workers, teachers, working in that different way at a local level. Yeah.
Was Sure Start any part of it?
Well, see, Sure Start was just another initiative, wasn't it? And it was about, as well, it seemed to be quite a lot about centres, and it was time limited. And it was a separate pot of funding. What I'd be really clear about in place-based integration is it's not about more money. In fact, we were able to make it happen almost because of the recession, because it caused the police to say, we don't need all these people in headquarters, clear all that lot out, reduce the workforce, but we can actually be a lot more effective by joining up in a different way and enable us to do things which we weren't able to do before, because, to be fair to Theresa May, she did away with that whole performance regime. I mean, I could give you another lecture about the madness of the target regime in policing, which made it really, really difficult to work across. I would say to my staff, do whatever is best for local people. If the big issue in your area is children are not going to school, write PCSOs, get up in the morning, out there at 8 o'clock, knock on a few doors, get those children to school. So it's within that context, of recognising these are the things which get in the way, and if you join things up in a fundamentally different way and you have a commitment to bringing in local people, you will start to see success stories. And, the great good news is when you have local community activists who, as I say, find those solutions. It's awful if your local youth club run by the council is closed down because of the cuts. But if that means that a few parents get together with a local business and the mosque and the church and say we're going to open and we're going to staff it with volunteers, I think that's probably a better solution, because it breaks the idea that it's the job of the council to look after your kids. No, it's not. It's the job of the community to bring up children and for everybody to recognise that responsibility.
Question here, thank you.
I'm also a graduate of this university. The only thing that's unusual about that is that I graduated in 1952, right. 65 years ago.
Indeed.
So that makes me perhaps the youngest person here.
Yeah.
My question relates to the work of Sir Michael Marmot, in that he's shown quite clearly that there is a pattern of early death associated with deprivation. And in particular, specific case is that in Stockport, in Brinnington, the mortality in Brinnington is 14 years younger than the leafy suburb of Bramhall. And is there a correlation between this early mortality and the pattern of damaged families which you've described?
Yes, I think there is. It's interesting you point to that study, because it's in the French guy I quoted. He absolutely points to that. In France, they've got exactly the same dynamic, that actually mortality rates are increasing between certain groups who are dying far younger. So I think that is absolutely related to issues like early relationships, health outcomes, the fact that, again, there's a whole series of factors behind. If you don't have good attachment, your brain grows at a slower rate in your skull. And that means when you go to school, you probably are not going to achieve. And you're probably going to start falling out with the teacher, who's probably going to regard you as a bit of a problem, and you may well end up being suspended or expelled, and away we go on the conveyor belt. And then obviously you have all the issues about isolationism, poor relationships, and potentially addiction. So when you put all that together, it is probably not surprising that absolutely you see those decline in lifespans. And I think it's well known in Stockport. I think it's got the biggest gap, isn't it, of any borough between the richest and the poorest. And that's exactly the sort of challenge that that we face in recognising that there can be enormous wealth and fairly enormous poverty just a few miles down the road.
I think we've just got time for one more question, so I'm going to take the lady at the back.
Thanks. I was really worried then you were going to ask all men. So Peter, I've been a school counsellor in the Greater Manchester area for the last 10 years, and I would certainly agree with you when you say that multiculturalism multiculturalism does work in Manchester. But what I think doesn't work is the engagement between the social classes. And right now in Manchester schools, high schools, we've got over subscriptions that are off the scale for 2 high schools in the city, in Manchester. And there is a school, I won't name it, that people are flat refusing to send their children to, and we are having no end of problems with placing children in schools. And that conversation that we've had around social aspiration is you know, limiting a lot of children who otherwise would do very, very well in a school if only they could get in because they live closer to it. What I'd like to ask you is, how do we hold our schools more accountable? How do we drive up these standards? How do we as communities engage with people from more affluent backgrounds, pool our resources? Because what I've noticed is that where children have greater PTAs, lots of support from the parents and the communities, lots of time invested, there is greater, achievement. Yeah. Whereas in some of the other areas, people aren't invited to meetings. If they can, they can't always attend. Yeah. There's all these issues and problems. When I was growing up, being poor didn't equate to being having no chances. It was all about your family and your aspirations. I would still agree now, and I know many parents of single families who have routines and boundaries, and they keep their children within routines and boundaries, and these are also very, very important things in terms of a child's attachment and development. So how do we hold people accountable, the council, and drive up these standards so that all schools are equal?
I mean, I think you made some really good points. I mean, the gaps are quite enormous, and you're right, a lot of it is quite subtle stuff about, you know, the experiences that young people and families get and what are the connections they can make. And obviously various people have written a lot about, you know, the decline in social mobility. And absolutely, you know, I'm not as old as this wonderful gentleman here, but I came through an era where I grew up in a working class community, got a full grant to go to university and all that stuff. I don't think it's just an issue about holding schools to account, certainly not in a league table way. And for me, it needs, as part of the Northern Powerhouse, an absolute commitment to say that's almost got to be our #1 priority. Because if we can drive up educational standards, aspiration, that of itself will break down some of the isolationism and some of the inequality and really be the powerhouse. And my feeling at the moment is I've not seen that given enough priority. And part of that is absolutely as communities need to be more angry, parents need to be more demanding and more aspirational, so they're actually pushing that, but again seeing it as co-production. It can't be just a customer relationship. It is about how all that works together, and I'm sure Nancy's doing lots of things on this, but I do think, you know, the wonderful institutions we've got in Greater Manchester need to look to see is there more that they can do to raise the standards and aspirations, and just that Greater Manchester-wide commitment to say we want to really drive up standards, because that's going to be the key to our success. And Nancy, just before you go, can I just quickly, my PowerPoint and my presentation was put together by a wonderful young person called Anna. One of the great wonderful things about Retrack, I work with 4 amazing young women who are all graduates of this university, have got the most amazing passion and dedication. Anna is actually Polish. She speaks English and writes English better than me. But I just want to acknowledge that a lot of my ideas come from working with a remarkable group of people. Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you. So finally, I'd like to invite Janine Watson, who leads your Alumni Association, to thank Peter on your behalf.
On behalf of the Alumni Association and on behalf of everyone in the room, everyone on the internet and everyone who's going to watch this recorded in future, Peter, I'd like to thank you very much for your perceptions, your insight and the experience that you've brought today to that talk. It was a pleasure to hear it, and I think you've been a little bit provocative as well about some of the things that you think ought to happen in the future. We look forward to hearing more about that. So on behalf of everyone, can I ask everyone again to thank Peter very much. I'd also like to draw your attention to a couple of things. The wonderful team that have put this together tonight, their colleagues are already planning some future events. So on Sunday, there will be a purple wave of alumni taking part in the Greater Manchester Run. So we'd like to wish all of them well. They're helping to raise money for scholarships, for so many things. So good luck on Sunday. And then a date for your diary on June the 28th. We'll be having the next Your Manchester Insight lecture, and this is by Professor Barry Cooper. He's a world-renowned expert on Beethoven, and I understand he's going to be reconstructing some of Beethoven's unfinished works using notes that have been left. So have a look on the internet and try and find that if you're interested in that. So on that, I'd like to invite you all now to make your way downstairs where I think you can have some drinks, some mingling and enjoy each other's company. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming tonight.
No, thank you.